as I've said, it takes commitment, right? Where I know that we have 10%. I don't mean to be putting anyone down. I'm just talking about a level of commitment, right? Really getting in, diving in, and doing something. Being involved will not only change the people around you, it changes your own life and your own perspective. And I think one of the greatest examples of that in many ways is one of the most famous families we have, and that's the Kennedy family. I've had the honor and pleasure to be able to call Robert Kennedy Jr. a very close friend of mine. And I've sat in conversations with him when he's talked about what it was like to grow up in the Kennedy family. His grandfather would make them stand at the end of the table and recite, having memorized very long poems before they'd be allowed to eat at dinner. And his own father would drive through impoverished neighborhoods and say, these are your people. These who we protect, not the people that can protect themselves, those who are not capable of handling their own issues or need to be helped. And so in that family, look at how many senators and politicians that run, different sporting events and take care of handicapped. I mean, is it genetic? I mean, is that genetic? Is it just simply because if you're born a Kennedy, that means you just do something? Or is it how they're socialized in that family to make a difference? Maybe we all can take a little playbook from that and say, you know what? I want my kids to be active. I want them to be out there. I want them to be able to speak their truth. Well, nobody does it better, and probably the statesman of this movement is Robert Kennedy Jr., and he, made his way into Europe just recently, just a few weeks ago, to speak in Italy, and this was that profound, prophetic, and dynamic moment.
No government in the history of mankind has ever relinquished power voluntarily. The power that they have taken away from us over the past 20 months, they will never give back. They have taken away our freedom of speech. They have closed the churches. They have taken away jury trials against companies, no matter how negligent they are, no matter how reckless they are, no matter how grievous your injury, you cannot sue that company. They have taken away our property rights in the United States. They closed 1 million businesses for a year with no just compensation and no due process. They have taken away our right to be free of warrantless searches and seizures and surveillance by the government. This is a global coup d'etat against liberal democracy across the planet. And all of these rights that were taken away from us, these governments said it was temporary, it was only 2 weeks, it would be over. In truth, you can all see what's happening. They are taking those rights and they will never give them back unless we make them.
We've watched him speak to thousands of people all around the world, of course, here in the United States of America. He's really the statesman, I would say, both for the vaccine risk awareness movement, of course, one of the greatest environmental attorneys that the world has ever known. But the reason I want to talk about him today and have him on the show is because of this, the real Anthony Fauci. I just read this book, and I honestly cannot say enough. This may be the most important book of my lifetime. And I really mean that. We have been discussing on the High Wire Tony Fauci as we've gone through this pandemic. There's been a lot of conversations about, what is it he's doing, how much he's manipulating, the lies and the deceit, but nothing puts it together in a way like they have in this book. It's now the #1 seller on Amazon, bestseller on the New York Times list, Wall Street Journal, all of that without any help from the press, all in the backs of people that keep sharing this. It's my honor and my pleasure to be joined right now by Robert Kennedy Jr. I mean it. I tweeted out myself that in the future, the history books will record 2 groups of people, those that read this book and those that did not. And here's a spoiler alert. The people that are going to write those history books were the ones that read it because they're the only ones that are going to survive. It's so important. And so to begin with, why this book? Of all the things you could write about, why Tony Fauci?
Well, You know, Del, that I've been doing environmental law for 40 years, so I had a kind of a special insight on the dynamic of agency capture, which most Americans don't know about. Most Americans are idealistic, both liberal Democrats, conservative Republicans. They may be skeptical about public officials, but they kind of believe in their hearts that the public officials really are, at some level, public servants and are trying their best to do the right thing. And I had this unique insight because I've wrote over 500 lawsuits on environmental issues, and probably about a fifth of those, about 20%, were against government agencies like the EPA or like the state environmental agencies, because all agencies ultimately become sock puppets for their industries that they're supposed to regulate. And with the public health agencies, there is they suffer agency capture on steroids because of these unprecedented, unmatched financial entanglements that they have with the pharmaceutical industry. FDA gets 45% of its budget from pharmaceutical companies. CDC spends $4.9 billion of its $12 billion annual budget buying vaccines and then distributing it. So it really is a giant vaccine company, and the mercantile aspects of that have subsumed the regulatory responsibilities. NIH, which is Tony Fauci's agency, owns thousands of patents from pharmaceuticals that they've helped develop. And individuals within those agencies are collecting up to $150,000 a year in royalties from multiple patents, each one for life. So these are not public health agencies anymore. They are subsidiaries of the pharmaceutical company, and they do not, Tony Fauci does not do public health. He does pharmaceutical development and pharmaceutical promotion. And what I'm saying right now to you is going to sound like exaggeration or hyperbole to many, many Americans who hear that. But as you know, from having lived in this space for some time, but also having read that book, this is not speculation by me. It's not exaggeration. These people have nothing to do with public health. They are the opposite of public health regulators. They are promoting pharmaceutical products, and they are increasing their power, their wealth by doing so.
You know, I had an honor very early on in my journey with this vaccine discussion when you gave me a call and asked me to be a part of the commission you're putting together because of the meeting you were going to have at the National Institute of Health. Was set up by Donald Trump. Reed Cordish was the one attending there. And we put together a PowerPoint that you delivered masterfully in front of Francis Collins, head of the NIH, Anthony Fauci, and then other luminaries of our virology and autoimmune disease departments, as you would. And when I left that meeting, I know that we were all sort of saying to each other, as we had laid out all of our problems with the vaccine and the safety trials and things like that, all of the childhood vaccines. And I remember saying to each other, if we had any doubt about the position we had after leaving that meeting, we all just felt like this is real. We really have a problem here. These people are blind. And when I got back home, I said to my wife, because it was the first time, I really didn't know who Anthony Fauci was, but I said to my wife, you know, all these people that I was sitting across from, I felt like they really believed that they were doing what was right for the public, that they somehow just didn't ask themselves the right, questions that would like put any sort of pressure on their value system. Or maybe we haven't done the proper safety studies, or as you so eloquently put out, why aren't you doing a vaccinated versus unvaccinated study with your own databases? But I said to my wife, there was one guy in that meeting that wasn't like the rest. I truly believe that I was sitting across from someone that was evil. His intentions, he seemed to, unlike everyone else, really know what was going on, really be manipulating the conversation. And I said, it's this guy named Anthony Fauci. He wasn't to me as big a deal as he is now. And I was a little bit too young to be paying attention to the AIDS crisis, which you cover so well in this book. But my question to you is, you lay this out. I mean, and I was saying this right before we got on here, that with this book, I would recommend people buy sheetrock and some putty, because you're gonna put holes in your wall from the frustration you feel that a man like this has been manipulating science the way he is. Is Tony Fauci evil?
Well, you know, I really try to avoid speculating about what's going on in his head or why he does the things that he's supposed to do. I try to be really disciplined about the outlaw writing the book and just kind of record the facts. But if you look at the facts, it's very, very clear that he suffers from some kind of sociopathy. In other words, some lack of empathy, some lack of basic human morality, because he makes decisions. There's a German word, it's something like Schlichtesker, but it's what during the Nazi era, there were people who worked in the death camps, and they, actually killed people. They put people in the ovens, in the gas chambers, etc. But the worst of the bureaucrats, according to, people like Hannah Arendt, were the people who murdered from behind desks, who murdered from a distance, who made these huge, vast decisions, which had consequences in taking homicidal consequences. Thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people, and then they went home and played with their children and kissed the dog, and and loved old people and children and all this. And Hannah Arendt called those people desk killers, and it's a mystery to me about why people end up like that. But that's Tony Fauci. He has made decisions which he knows, he has to know, are lethal to people, but I assume, makes an excuse in his head. He's developing a medicine that is good for all of humanity at some point, and therefore his decisions to sacrifice, that certain people are collateral damage in his experiments, are somehow morally justified. And after that meeting that you and I had with him, he came up to me after that meeting and said, and he pulled me aside in the corridor and he said, keep doing what you're doing. You're doing a good job, and you need to keep pushing us. That's what he said to me. But if you remember when we were in that meeting, we said to him, because you and I have been saying for 2 years, because we figured this out.
Right.
They've never done a placebo-controlled study. Tony Fauci's constantly talking about we need a placebo-controlled study before we do ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine. They've never done a placebo-controlled study on any vaccine prior to approving it, not one.
Right.
We said, and incidentally, they also didn't do it on masks or lockdowns or social distancing or anything else. He only needs those for things he doesn't want. At that meeting, he had publicly been saying for years, Bigtree and Bobby Kennedy are lying. We do placebo-controlled studies on every vaccine. At that meeting, you and I said to him, and Aaron Siri, and we said, can you show us those studies? And he said, we don't have them here. And they were looking through their files.
Yeah.
You remember that?
Yeah, I do.
And then they said, well, we don't have them here with us, but we can send them to you. So we said, okay, will you send them? And there was a guy. The reason they were being kind of civil to us is there was kind of a referee in the room from the White House, from the West Wing, that they had sent, who wasn't part of the health establishment, but they wanted to look at what would happen when, our story met their narrative.
Right.
And, to try to figure it out. So they were on their best behavior that day because they were performing for the guy in the White House. So when we said, do you have these studies? They said, yes, we do have them. We just don't have them with us. So they said, we'll send them to you. And of course, They didn't send us anything. And then you and I and Aaron Seary sued them and said, okay, show them to us. And then after a year and a half of litigation on the courthouse steps, they came out and said, yeah, you're right, we don't have any. We've never done a placebo-controlled study of any vaccine, of any of the 72 vaccines that we have mandated for our children.
Yeah, none of the singular vaccines, none of the program of the entire group of vaccines. You know, you got into this in some detail, and you got into some things that I had suspected, but put it together really well. This is something we kind of all know by watching The High Wire, but I want to show how you lay it out in this book so clearly. In this one section of the book, you're talking about antibody-dependent enhancement, which has been really important to us from the moment this happened in Wuhan. So here's what the book says. In April 26, 2020, interview with pharma troll Dr. Zubin Z-Dog Damania, Merck's top vaccine promoter, Dr. Paul Offit, amplified these concerns. Paul Offit said binding antibodies can be dangerous and can cause something called antibody-dependent enhancement, and we've seen that. I mean, we saw that with the Gates-funded dengue vaccine. But with the dengue vaccine in children who had never been exposed to dengue before, it actually made them worse when they were then exposed to the natural virus. Much worse. Vaccinated children who were less than 9 years of age, who had never been exposed to dengue before, were more likely to die if they'd been vaccinated than if they hadn't been vaccinated. You go on to then say that he wasn't the only one. Even Tony Fauci, during his March 26, 2020 White House coronavirus briefing, acknowledged the perils of pathogenic priming, which is another word for antibody-dependent enhancement. The issue of safety is something I want to make sure the American public understands. Does the vaccine make you worse? And there are diseases in which you vaccinate someone, they get infected with what you're trying to protect them with, and you actually enhance the infection. That's the worst possible thing you could do. Vaccinate somebody to prevent infection and actually make them worse. And you sort of conclude with a list of issues. And you said, number one, right after that, Dr. Fauci's first approach was to abort the 3-year clinical trials at 6 months and then vaccinate the controls, a preemption that would prevent detection of long-term injuries, including pathogenic priming or the antibody-dependent enhancement. Regulators initially intended the Pfizer vaccine trial to continue for 3 full years. You go on to describe this. Now, what you show over and over again in this conversation is Fauci is well aware of these sort of long-term or mid-term issues. This one that's got us all the most concerned, which is what they saw in all of the animal trials, where you give the vaccine to the animal, it looks like they're safe, then you draw antibodies, they're producing antibodies, but when they challenge the animal with the actual virus, the vaccine doesn't block it or neutralize it. It seems to help the virus into the cells, leading to organ failure and death. Now, what you pointed out and what we sort of suspected is then Fauci designs a trial in which he acts like he's going to address all of our concerns, but this would be a concern that would be 6 months, maybe a year down the road in a human trial. But what does he do? Just a few short weeks after that second vaccine shot, he grabs this tiny little bit of data, says this is all we need to prove that we're 95% effective, and then calls emergency use authorization and then erases the control group and gives them all the vaccine. I didn't know he had done the same thing with AZT. And so it's like he selects what is going to be his favorite player and then designs a trial to make it look good. And with AZT, he knew that there were long-term effects. In fact, it had failed as an Ebola. It was having long-term effects when there were other drugs that were available that were safe. And then we saw it again with remdesivir. Remdesivir is a failed Ebola drug. Apparently, Ebola was better to handle on its own than the toxicity of this remdesivir drug, but he repurposes it for this relatively benign illness for about 99% of us. But that whole plan in which he designs a trial and then cuts it short before you would see the long-term results, I thought this was the first time it was being done, and you show this incredible, it's not even a history, it's like a playbook that he uses over and over again.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And with the AZT, he terminated the study after 8 weeks. It was supposed to, again, be a 3-year study. He unblinds it, gives AZT to all the controls, declare that it's so successful that it's unethical to keep it from the controls. And then he erases the control group. And what he didn't tell anybody that people found out later is that AZT was so hideously toxic. It's like remdesivir.
Yeah.
The NCI, the National Cancer Institute, when they developed it, They threw it on the junk heap. They developed it as a cancer chemotherapy drug. And cancer chemotherapy drugs poison every cell in your body and will kill you. It will kill 100% of the people who take them if they take them up for a long period of time. What you hope is you give it to them for 2 weeks and hope it kills the tumor before it kills the person. And so, but AZT was so toxic it killed all the mice in the experiment. They threw it on the junk heap. Early on, GlaxoSmithKline found that when they put AZT in a culture with HIV, it killed all the HIV. Not surprising, it killed everything.
Right.
Tony Fauci developed it as the only AIDS drug, and he had to do the same thing he did with the vaccines. He had to kill all of the repurposed medications. And he had to keep the people who were getting AZT were dying so fast that he began sneaking them transfusions. So a lot of those people were getting full blood transfusions every day to keep them alive for the 8-week period so he could declare victory. Then he got the permission to use the drug, or, he walked it through FDA like he does through a fixed FDA panel that's made up of his paid investigators. And then he mandated it for everybody, not only who has AIDS, but people who are deemed by a PCR test to have HIV, many of whom would never get sick. And virtually everybody who was on AZT died. Most of them died within a year. Almost all of them died within 2 years. He killed with AZT probably 330,000 people during the 1980s and early 1990s. The other thing he did now, which is part of this playbook that you're talking about, is he suppressed all of the drugs. There were local doctors who were treating AIDS patients in New York and San Francisco and Dallas, etc. They were finding a lot of drugs that worked for the AIDS symptoms very, very effectively. Aerosol pentazine was one of those. It had tremendous efficacy. But the AIDS patients, most of whom were impoverished because they couldn't work, were unable to get it because the insurance companies would not give it to them because it wasn't approved by FDA. They were begging Tony Fauci to get FDA to approve, but he refused. He said, we don't have placebo-controlled trials.
Right.
And so that's what the film Dallas Buyers Club is about, is people, Matthew McConaughey and a lot of other people with AIDS, who discovered that AZT was killing everybody who was taking it, and they were going to Mexico, to Canada, to Europe to get these drugs that actually work, smuggling them back to the United States and distributing them to AIDS patients. And Michelle Wallet, who wrote that film, initially made Tony Fauci the antagonist in her script. He was the villain in the film. In the end, when they made the film, they took him out of it. But he was the guy who was killing all these AIDS patients by denying them a drug that the local doctors had proven worked. My uncle, as I show in the book, Teddy Kennedy, was deeply involved in forcing Tony Fauci finally to approve this all-purpose medication. It's the exact same thing he's done with ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, killing these drugs because they compete with the vaccines that he knows his buddies are going to make money from.
You said it exactly right. He only likes a placebo-based control study when he's going to use it to destroy your ability to use a product. In this case,
well, he didn't use a placebo for remdesivir.
No.
Remdesivir was, as you point out, remdesivir was a drug that was developed by Gilead. It was actually, again, created by the National Cancer Institute, by NIH, and then given to Gilead, which is Bill Gates' has a huge investment in. And then Tony Fauci tried it on Zika, he tried it on Ebola. And in December of 2019, remember this was 1 month before the pandemic emergency is declared, it was in a trial in Africa with 4 other drugs where they were treating Ebola patients. Now, Ebola patients, 50% of them die.
Yep.
And the Safety Monitoring Board stepped in and said, you got to pull the remdesivir out of the trial. I think 30% of them died after they took it for 5 days. They said it's too dangerous to give to Ebola patients,
Right.
who are 50% of them are going to die. So a month later, Fauci takes that drug that he knows is too dangerous to give to Ebola patients, and he puts it in fake trials for COVID.
Right.
And he approved that drug, emergency use authorization, without having the study published, with having no data that showed that it prevented a single death. And he had to go in twice, fraudulently, change the study protocols to show that it reduced hospital stays by 3 days. He could not show that it prevented death. The WHO and the Chinese then published studies almost simultaneously saying not only does it not prevent deaths, and these were actually very powerful studies, really good studies with real placebos. They said not only does it not prevent deaths, it does not reduce hospital stays. Nevertheless, Tony Fauci got this drug approved. And the reason he got it approved is because you can only give remdesivir with intravenous, which means it can only be used on hospital patients, which means it would not compete with vaccines.
Right.
So under the federal law, he had to kill ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, because under the federal law, you cannot give emergency use authorization to a vaccine if there is an approved drug approved for any purpose that is demonstrated to be effective against the target disease. So if anybody had shown that ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine, or if, let's say, if Fauci had to acknowledge that ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine.
Right, because clearly we have, hundreds, if not thousands of studies at this point around the world showing exactly that, but he's not giving it the check of approval.
Right, there's about 285 studies, most of them peer-reviewed, that show ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine collectively reduce hospital stays by 80%, reduce deaths by 80%. 80% of the people who died from COVID in this country did not need to die. And that's why, we used remdesivir in this country, and we had a monopoly on it for the first year because he convinced Trump to buy 100% of the supplies. Well, that's one of the reasons we had the highest deaths.
Right.
Because death from remdesivir looks like death from COVID. It's kidney failure, it's pulmonary edema, all the things that COVID does to kill you, remdesivir does to kill you. So nobody knew,
right.
None of the doctors knew whether their patients were dying. And this is the same thing that happened with ACT. At the end of the year, the United States has 4.2% of the world's population, and it has 20% of the world's COVID deaths. We have the highest body count of any country in the world. The Chinese, who use early treatment, including chloroquine, which is the cousin of hydroxychloroquine, eliminated the pandemic in 2 months. Pandemic was gone from China by April. They used all of the things that our doctors like McCulloch and Corey were telling the government these things work: antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, anticoagulants, steroids, monoclonal antibodies, all of the ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. If you use those things, this is a manageable disease. It's like a seasonal flu. He had to block all of those things in order to make way for his vaccines, and that's what he did. And that's why the Chinese had a population death rate. In other words, 3 people die from COVID per million population. Our population death rate was 2,200 per million. We have the worst body counts on earth. I don't know how Tony Fauci has a job today. He has the worst record of failure of any health minister on the globe. Absolutely. And, it's all about pushing his drugs with remdesivir and vaccines.
Which makes me want to challenge sort of your original statement when I brought it up. And I know you're trying to be nice and you're trying to, be objective. But you said you believe Fauci, that he's got some sort of sociopathic tendencies, but that he believes he's, helping people. I actually disagree with that. In reading your book and how well you laid it out, I believe that probably is true about Paul Offit. I believe that's true about Stanley Plotkin. I think Stanley Plotkin, who's the godfather of the vaccine world, I think he genuinely knows I'm killing some children. He has said we're at war with nature and there's casualties to that war, but he's trying to get to a place where one day I think Stanley Plotkin believes we'll be able to vaccinate for every illness in the world. We'll have beat God, we'll have beat nature, and therefore we'll never be able to die again, or some crazy thought like that. But it's well-intentioned. Fauci is much different. Fauci is taking products he knows work. He sees the evidence, like hydroxychloroquine, like ivermectin, in the case where AZT was out there, many of the drugs that they were using that they were having success with, and he does the same playbook. I will not even recommend those till I see a double-blind placebo study. He knows they're off patent, so they can't make any, there's not enough money for the pharmaceutical industry to do a $100 million double-blind placebo study, or, whatever that would cost huge numbers if they're going to do it right. And so he knows he basically buries those treatments that would cost you pennies on the dollar, and then he supports a product like remdesivir that he knows cause organ failure. With AZT, he cut the trial short because he knew it killed people. As you said, he's giving transfusions to keep them alive and not giving transfusions to the control group so they look like they were dying. This is a manipulative, scary human being that, when I read the book, I thought, when he said
his attacks on me, quite frankly, are attacks on science.
And we all laughed. So what did egomaniac? It's actually true. I now recognize after reading this book that Tony Fauci is the one that erased the scientific method. He took away all the double-blind studies. He's the one using billions of dollars to hand to the universities. If they make him happy, then he'll give them another drug to work on. And but if they don't make him happy, he pulls the funding. Those professors get fired. Those scientists get fired because they were challenging the system. He is literally controlling the education system. He's controlling what drugs come through the pipeline. If you don't make if you don't make the Godfather happy, then you don't get your next drug sold. I mean, he is moving billions of dollars to erase scientific competition and any questioning of the orthodoxy. It's so terrifying. But beyond that, I just want to move on to one other point because I know you've got to run. We all saw these.
I just want to say you have convinced me, Al.
Okay.
But one thing is right. He has destroyed science, and he has made science religion.
Yes.
And it's all, there's no citation. He never cites a study. It's all about appeals to authority. Science is what I say it is. And he has all these acolytes around him who are dependent on his funding, who genuflect to that dogma, that theology. And, one of them, just a good example, Peter Hotez, who is this venomous little, toady for Tony Fauci. Yeah. And he's actually lobbying to make it a felony, a federal crime, imprisoned by more than a year, to criticize Tony Fauci. So, and Tony Fauci's encouraging this kind of adulation and adoration by the public, and it's really bizarre that he gets away with it. And he said last week, once again, people who question me are questioning science. They're anti-science. It's like Louis XIV said, "Je suis le stat, I am the state." And he's saying, "I am science."
Yes, and I think he is responsible now for at least hundreds of thousands of deaths during this pandemic. I think his effect on the world, you could probably argue millions now they're being denied working probable treatments that show success around the world. AZT, throw on another, 500,000 or so people that died that didn't need to because they were denied life-saving products while he pushed a deadly product on people. But we all saw these images recently when it looked like he was really getting hot water. Right at the moment this gain of function conversation came up, then all of a sudden these images came out where he was torturing beagles, and somehow it's almost like, I think he threw that out there, like, let me deal with beagle torture over, going to jail for crimes against humanity or being linked in some way to the release of a virus that I might have had something to do with. But this part of your book, I heard a lot of talk back then, well, he did it to children too, but we couldn't really find those sources. You actually dug that up. I want to get in this part of the book because I think it's critical to show how sick this world really is. Let me have these slides. Between 1985 and 2005, NIAID and its pharma partners conscripted at least 532 infants and children from foster care in New York City as human subjects of clinical trials testing NIAID's experimental AIDS drugs and vaccines. ICC and the Medical Research Center that conducted the trials received substantial payments for hosting the experiments from both the National Institute of Health and the manufacturer of the drugs, among them all the list of everybody that's ever been in court for killing people with dangerous products. The Vera Institute, relying mostly on city ACS documents, confirmed 80 deaths and that many other children suffered serious harm. The child welfare files contained information indicting that some children experienced serious toxicities or side effects from trial medications, such as reduced liver function or severe anemia. These toxicities were consistent with the toxicities described in published articles about the trials. Fauci poo-pooed all those deaths, recalls Vera Sharav. The very best thing you could say about Dr. Fauci is that he failed to get involved when problems emerged on his management watch. You go on to list, out of 532 children participating in clinical trials or observational studies, died while in 80 of the 532 died. 25 of the children died while enrolled in a medication trial. 64 children participated in 30 medication trials that were not reviewed by a special medical advisory panel. He was doing this without any purview or vision from medical authorities for ethics, and 21 children participated in trials that the panel had reviewed but had not recommended. And then in a different section of the book, you sort of reference this again, and there was this paragraph just ripped me apart. If the children refuse the drugs, they're held down and force-fed. If the children continue to resist, they're taken to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, where a surgeon puts a plastic tube through their abdominal wall into their stomachs. From then on, the drugs are injected directly into their intestines. He did this to Latino children, mostly African-American children, those who had no parents, that their parents were drug addicts, were put in foster care, and he used these innocent children as guinea pigs and essentially murdered them in trials with products that already had terrible side effects and knew about it. I mean, it's so incredible. Here it was. In 2002, 2 children ages 6 and 12 had debilitating strokes due to the drug toxicities. The 6-year-old went blind. They both died shortly after. Another 14-year-old died recently. I mean, just indiscriminately, essentially killing children that were in poorer, areas or in foster care. How is this guy still here? How have so many politicians looked the other way on this evidence that's been presented to them?
Yeah, and one of the worst things about those experiments, Al, is that it turns out many of those kids, if not most of them, did not even have HIV. So there's not even a pretense that there was hidden benefit for these children in being guinea pigs for these drugs. These kids were chosen because they didn't have parents to protect them. And the law says you can't do that. The law says if they don't have parents, the state has to appoint a guardian, and the guardian cannot allow experimentation on those kids unless there's a clear benefit from the medication to the children. And that's the only way that you can legally do it. So Tony Fauci made sure that none of those kids had guardians, which is illegal. And then he hid what he was doing from the boards. He took foster homes in 6 states and he turned them over to the pharmaceutical industry. He made sure that the people who were running those foster homes did not even have medical training. Most of them were immigrants who came from the Dominican Republic. They knew nothing about medicine or responsibilities, and they were sickened when they realized slowly what they were involved in doing to these children, that they were torturing these children. And there's videos of these children, an old BBC documentary that will make you cry. I promise you cannot look at these without weeping. One of these kids, a 12-year-old who's trying to protect the 8-year-old, and he has a tube in his stomach. And he's telling them, I tried to fight them, and this is what they do if you fight them. You can't fight them. You need to just take the drugs. And the kids didn't want to take them because the drugs were making them horribly sick. And Celia Farber, who's this amazing researcher who worked on this chapter for me and did a lot of the original research on it, she actually went up to Hawthorne, New York, to the Gates of Heaven Cemetery. She found the cemetery where Fauci was disposing of the corpses of these children who died in his illegal experiments. She found an open pit. It was actually covered by a by an astroturf carpet. She opened the astroturf carpet and she saw hundreds and hundreds of tiny little coffins stacked haphazardly upon each other, because these are children who have no parents and nobody was there to protect them. And Tony Fauci treated them as collateral damage, and his objective was to enlarge the markets for these pharmaceutical companies who he had partnered with by allowing HIV, these toxic chemotherapy drugs, to be given to children. And then the next experiments, which are in the next chapter, which are equally horrendous, is his experiments on Africans.
Yeah.
To try to open markets for the maternal, to end maternal transmission of AIDS. So he was giving the most toxic drugs known to humanity to pregnant women, many of whom with their babies, many of whom did not have HIV, to see what the tolerance levels were. In other words, not to try to help them, to see how much they could take before their babies would abort or before they would die.
Oh my God.
He is a monster.
So to finish this up, really, and I know you got to run, I was amazed at how you sort of show this cycle happening over and over again. This, the way that he chooses the products, he denies the products would help people. There's a moment in the AIDS story where he is clearly, everyone's turned on him. Even the politicians that, I don't know if they're bought out or whatever, been on his side, they're turning on him, the entire gay community. And it looks like his days are numbered. And he does this about face. I don't want to give it away, but he really managed to sort of, in his slippery way, bring everybody together in a kumbaya moment and make them think that he's going to be their savior. And he slips out, and you think, how is that possible? It was so clear, the death and destruction he had caused, the uselessness of his department, and how dangerous he was. We find ourselves in that moment again, where it seems obvious to a growing multitude of people in this country and around the world that not only does he have the highest death rate in the greatest hospital system that's ever existed, and how you can explain that, I have no idea. But we see the destruction of our use of treatments that could work. Instead, remdesivir, that so many people are calling us and saying, my brother, my father, my mother was fine until they put her on the remdesivir, and now she's dead. Is he going to get away with this? I mean, I know you've been wanting to go after him. I feel like, you want a lawsuit. This book is, I don't know if this is just your lawsuit at the beginning of it. Is he going to get away with this? Because he didn't have you on his ass then, and he didn't have me on his ass. Are we going to get this guy, Bobby?
I sure hope so. I can tell you I know you are doing this, and I can. And CHD is using that book as a template for litigation, and we're meeting with attorney generals. We have attorneys who are preparing suits, and at some point we are going to bring Tony Fauci to justice.
That's fantastic. Bobby, it's a tour de force, the real Anthony Fauci. I cannot say enough about this book. I wouldn't be telling you to get this if I didn't mean it. Get yourself a copy. Get everyone a copy for Christmas. Get your governor a copy. Walk in your senator's office and say, explain this, and then I will reelect you. If you do not read this or understand what's happening in our health agencies, then you will never be elected by me again. We have got to get this out to everyone we know. This is a game changer, Bobby. It is so powerful, so impactful. Every chapter ends with nearly 3 pages of citations, which I love, because now I can prove, I can go in and find the evidence that's here. The real Anthony Fauci, Robert Kennedy Jr., you are a hero. I am so honored to know you. The times we've gotten to work together have been highlights of my life, and I look forward to the moment where we get this guy and put him behind bars, because that's where he deserves to be.
Me too, Del. Thanks for everything you do.
All right. Take care. If you like that clip, then be sure to check out our live broadcast of The High Wire every Thursday morning at 11 a.m. Pacific Time. You can watch it on iTunes and Twitter. We'll see you there.